person or that person, or make a system of law that will tell you who to believe. So what do? Typically, we leave it up to the jury. You say, you'll hear the witnesses, you'll hear the claimants, and whatever feels right to you, you will decide and you will rule based on that. And that's the hallmark of our system. The Torah system is different. The Torah system, there is no jury. The Torah sort of lays out certain claims. When somebody says a certain claim, automatically that triggers a certain legal result. In other words, we're not even sure who to believe. But if you say this, it triggers a certain result. If you say something else, it triggers a different legal result. And that's part of what we're going to be discussing. Certain claims, how do we evaluate the opposing claims, and how do we rule when there is dispute? Now, let's keep things easy. If I can prove witnesses, if I can bring witnesses that will prove my case, then it's a case closed, and we don't have to get together at 10 o'clock in the morning to read what to do. That's easy, right? We're talking about a case where there are no witnesses. So it's he said, she said. It's he said, he said. So what do you do in that case? How do you rule which claims are more believable? This is the subject of this section of Maimonides, Toen and Vinitan. It has, I'm looking right here, it has 16 chapters. Don't worry, we're not going to do all of them today. Don't worry about that. It's got 16 chapters, and we'll try to make at least a little bit of progress. Okay, let's start with the easy one. And the reason why this is an easy one is because this is a case that's spelled out explicitly in the Torah. Pretty clear. I mean, it's not so clear, but based on the Talmudic derivation, this is what the Torah means. So I asked you a question. Let's keep it simple. The case in the Talmud is called, some of you may have came across it. In the Talmud, it's called Modeh B'Miktzat. Modeh B'Miktzat means partial admission. So let's keep the case easy. So Andy comes to me and says, Menachem, you owe me $100. Now, I don't want to pay Andy $100. I just don't want to do it. So I have two choices. One choice is I say, I don't owe you anything. That's called Kofer HaKol. It's an outright, a complete denial. I deny everything. That's one scenario. The other scenario is what they call Modeh B'Miktzat, partial admission. So Andy says, Menachem, you owe me 100. I say, Andy, I owe you 50. Okay? So who do you follow? What's the law? Scenario, let's put it out here if you want to jump in. Scenario one, I deny everything. I say, Andy, I owe you nothing. Scenario two, I say, Andy, I owe you partial. I only owe you 50. Where would you believe me more? Where would I, the defendant, be more believable? Scenario A or scenario B, if anybody wants to jump in?
Scenario B, because
Scenario B is more believable because
you've made what in common law, American law, would say an admission against your interest. You've admitted you owe something.
Okay. If I admit, Andy, I'm very happy I have you here because you know the American law, and the beauty of the Torah will be seen when we contrast it to the American law, so you see what the Torah is doing. So thank you for joining us here this morning. Okay, so Andy says, and this is very logical, Andy says, believe person B, believe scenario B. What does that mean? Andy says, I owe him 100. I could have denied it. I say I owe you 50. So I'm believable. Why am I believable? Because I'm speaking against my interest. If I wanted to lie, I would say I owe you nothing. Right? So if I'm speaking against my interest, believe me, and I only have to pay you 50. That's what Andy would say. The Torah comes at it from a different perspective. It's not a question of which one's right. It's a different system based on a different set of values, based on different how the Torah evaluates the people it's talking to. I'm not sure this would work in America. But here's the Torah's claim. Here's the Talmud. Here's what the Talmud says. If Andy comes to me and says, Menachem, you owe me 100. What do I say? I say, Andy, I owe you nothing. What's the law? The law is I don't have to pay anything. Why don't I have to pay anything? Because Andy has no proof. Right? Andy wants me to pay him. So there's a possession is 9/10 of the law. That's what they say in America. In the Talmud, they say, if you want to extract money from your fellow, the burden of proof is upon you. So Andy wants me to pay him $100. So the burden of proof is upon Andy. Andy has no proof. I don't have to pay him. All right, so that's easy. So if I walk up to you in the street and in Whole Foods and I say, hey, you owe me $100, and you say, I don't, you don't have to pay me because I have no proof. What happens if I walk up to you in Whole Foods and I say, you owe me $100, and you say, yeah, I owe you 50? Says the Talmud, oh, there's a problem here. What's the problem? Well, you pay 50 because that's what you agree, but we're a little suspect. We're a little suspect, and I'll tell you why in a moment, but we're a little suspect in my claim when I have a partial admission. And therefore, I pay 50, and then I have to take an oath. I have to swear that I don't owe you the other 50. So here's what's happening. If I deny it straight out, I don't have to take any oath. If I give a partial admission and I say I owe you 50 and I pay you 50, then I have to take an oath on the remaining 50. Why is that? So Maimonides is not going to say, Maimonides are just going to read the law. We'll read it inside in a minute. What's the logic? So the logic is fascinating. You may agree, you may not agree, but it's fascinating. It's fascinating because as follows. The Talmud is concerned, the Talmud says the Torah is concerned that I'm being a little dishonest here. Really, I owe Andy 100. The reason why I would like to deny it outright. I would like to say, Andy, I owe you nothing. But I can't do it. Why can't I do it? Because of a principle called, it's very hard for a person to have chutzpah to the person who did him a favor. So Andy does me a favor, he loaned me $100. I don't have the audacity to say, Andy, I owe you nothing. I just can't do it. I'm too good of a person. So what do I do to quell my consciousness? I say, you know what? I'll say 50. But really, I want to deny it outright because I'm not interested in paying you. But I have a guilty conscience. So to quell my guilty conscience, I'll say, you know what? I'll pay you 50. So it turns out from the perspective of the Talmud, it's unlikely that somebody that owes you money will deny it outright. It's much more likely, at least to the community that the Torah is talking to, it's much more likely that they would start playing games. They would start saying, well, I owe you partially. Why? Because it's hard for them, it's hard for the person to lie, to have all that audacity in the face of the person who did him a favor. So therefore we say, look, if you're giving a partial admission, that's a little suspect. So therefore pay the 50 that I agree upon. And the other 50, you can't make me pay because Andy has no proof, but the other 50 I will take an oath. That's called the case of a modeh b'miktzat, of a partial admission. And that's what we're going to learn about in chapter 1, section 1. And once we do section 1, now we go, then we have all different kinds of cases and all different types of details where things change in the remainder of chapter 1. But the first, but you see how organized it is, that it starts chapter 1 is the principle, and the principle is partial admission. You have to pay 50, you have to pay what you admit, and you have to take a remainder on the rest. If I have an outright admission, in the Hebrew, kofer hakol, if I deny everything, then Andy walks up to me in the street and says, you owe me $100. I say, sorry, I owe you nothing. The law is, I owe you nothing, and I don't have to take an oath because Andy does not have any proof. If Andy tells me you owe me 100 and I say I owe you 50, I pay 50, and then I have to take an oath. Why do I have to take an oath? Because we're afraid that maybe I'm really not being honest. And the reason why I'm not denying it outright is because I don't have the heart. I have too much Jewish guilt. So the Jewish guilt is a factor here which does not allow me to lie outright, but it will allow me to lie a little bit. I know you're looking at me funny and you're saying you're not lying. What's the difference between lying a lot and lying a little? So and we had this in the JLI a few years ago, a year or two ago, and there was a famous behavioral psychologist, an Israeli guy, Dan Ariely, I think his name was, and he ran all these kinds of studies, and basically they find that most people won't make a big lie, but most people are very comfortable making a small lie. And the reason for that is everybody wants to think they're a moral person, and when they have to make a big lie, then that gets in the way and that will make them uncomfortable. But a small lie, people don't mind to make. And this is an interesting a case where the Torah sees human psychology in the same way. That really, I owe you 100. but I'm not going to deny it outright because I don't have the heart, I have too much guilt. But I will deny part of it. And then when you make me take an oath, then that will get me back on the path because I don't want to violate the oath. The oath was considered a big deal in the Torah because of the third commandment. It says you're not allowed to take God's name in vain. And it says that God will not forgive anybody who takes God's name in vain. One more point before we read it inside and then we open it up for questions. One more point is that when you go to court today, everybody is taking oaths all day long. Both parties, everybody has to take an oath before they begin to talk. The witnesses have to take an oath. Everybody has to take an oath. But in the Torah system, it's very different. Biblically speaking, only 3 people take an oath. Only 3 cases we take an oath. We're going to read about those 3 cases. So the imposition of an oath was done very carefully and very discriminately. And that was part of the process of, like in this case, it was part of the process to try to figure out the truth, but it was not applied broadly across the board. It was only applied carefully in specific cases, as the Maimonides is going to lay out when we get to section number 2. So I'm just going to read section 1 inside. I have it in the English. Even if you don't have the English, you could listen because I already told you everything you need to know. And we will read it inside, and then we'll see if we can get any discussion. If not, we'll go to number 2 because we're studying code now, so it's not going to be. We could make some progress. Okay. It says Maimonides. Maimonides is very organized. Before every section, he talks about which commandments in the Torah are going to be addressed in this section. How many mitzvot addressed in this section? And he says as follows. Introduction to the laws of Toen, Vinitan. It contains 1 mitzvah. The laws when a person issues a claim against a colleague and he either admits or denies the claim. The mitzvah is explained in the following chapters. So there's a mitzvah that when somebody makes a claim and there's a counterclaim to rule and figure out what we do in the case of a claim and a counterclaim. Okay, so what does Maimonides begin with? Number 1, when a person who issues a claim against a colleague with regard to movable property and the defendant acknowledges a portion of the claim, right? So every word here is precise. It doesn't apply to land, as we'll discuss later. It applies to what Maimonides calls movable property, anything that is not land, any property that is not real estate. So if a person makes a claim and then the defendant acknowledges, he admits a portion of the claim, he must pay what he acknowledged and take an oath with regard to the remainder. How do we know? This is a scriptural obligation, as Exodus 22:8 states, that this is it. Okay, so I have to explain how this is derived from those words. Give me just one moment. I'm thinking now that it's possible that I could pull this up and put it on the screen. So I will try it and see what happens. Apologize for the delay. Vinitan chapter 1. Okay, this may work. Okay, I think that if this works, if it doesn't work, let me know. But so far, I think it's okay. We're up to right here, that this is it. I can't highlight, can I highlight it? That this is it. This is where we're up to in the blue. Okay, so what's happening here? What's happening here is that the verse says, this is it. So the context of the verse is as follows. The context of the verse is that there's a claim. Somebody makes a claim, and then the defendant says, this is it. Ki hu zeh, this is it. When we say this is it, we mean I only owe this part. I don't owe the entire claim. And the verse continues that the person has to take an oath. So that is the case where a person has to take an oath. That's one case. Here's the second paragraph is the other case that I did not say. Here we go. Similarly, if the defendant denies the entire obligation and says such a thing never happened, and one witness testifies that the defendant is obligated to the plaintiff, The defendant is obligated by scriptural law to take an oath. The oral tradition teaches whenever two witnesses would obligate the person to pay money, one witness obligates him to take an oath. So here's another case that we did not discuss. Another case when I have to take an oath. So say Andy comes to me and says, Menachem, you owe me $100. I deny it outright. Andy says, ladies and gentlemen, I have a witness that Menachem owes me $100. In that case, we know in the Torah we always follow two witnesses, and one witness does not prove anything. But one witness cannot make me pay, but one witness could make me take an oath. So again, we have two cases where I would have to take an oath. Number one is if I have a partial admission. Number two, if there's one witness testifying against me. Similarly, it was derived through the oral tradition that one witness shall not rise up against any man for any iniquity or any sin. That's the verse. The verse says, Lo yakum eid echad be'ish, meaning one witness shall not rise up against any man for any iniquity or any sin. Says the oral law, he may, however, rise up against him to obligate him to take an oath, right? So one witness cannot make me pay, but one witness can make me take an oath. So that, ladies and gentlemen, is the conclusion of section 1 of chapter 1 of the laws of the Toen and Vinitan, the claimer and the claimant. And to summarize, there's two scenarios where I would have to take an oath if somebody makes a claim against me. Scenario 1, if I have a partial admission. Scenario 2 is if I deny it outright, but there's one witness testifying against me. So these are the two cases that the Torah would tell you you have to make an oath. The first scenario, the Torah says so explicitly. The second scenario, the Torah does not say so explicitly, but it's derived. The Torah says two witnesses cannot make me pay and cannot impose punishment for a sin, which would mean other forms of corporal punishment like lashes. However, one witness, the oral tradition derives, one witness can make me impose an oath, can make me swear. So that is halacha 1. If anybody wants to add something or ask a question, that would be wonderful. Otherwise, we continue.
Rabbi, the difference between the results here and what we were discussing earlier about American common law, to what extent do you think the difference is a change in society, or the difference in that the Talmudic audience was a God-fearing society, a closely knit Jewish community?
So I would say that this is only going to work in a place where people sort of, with the culture, buys into the system of being afraid of God. And there's 2 points here. There's the point, for example, that we say imposing an oath. So what's happening here is, what does it mean to impose an oath? Impose an oath means that the Torah assumes that I don't mind to steal $50, but if you make me swear, I'm going to back off. So even if you suspect that I'm going to steal, you don't suspect that I'm going to swear falsely. Okay, that's not saying right or wrong. That's an estimation of how people feel about taking a false oath. I'll give you an interesting fact. The interesting fact is later on, generations later, centuries later, the rabbis look around and they say, you know something? We don't think this still stands. We don't think that somebody who's willing to steal will refrain from stealing because he has to take an oath. And that's why they don't really impose an oath anymore. And that becomes a little more complicated. What do you do when the Torah imposes an oath? But now we're not going to do it because the logic behind opposing an oath does not apply anymore. Because again, the logic is that a person is going to be deterred from stealing if you make him swear. But now we don't think people are going to do that anymore. Now, going back to the modern courthouse, 50% of the people are swearing falsely every day or every minute, right? Because in other words, that's the whole point here. The whole point is that now the only purpose of the oath in the secular system is to make it to make it perjury, right? If you take an oath, then if you say a lie, then it's perjury, which has a higher penalty. But in the Torah, you don't need that because it's perjury even without the oath, right? So the oath is an additional layer of security imposed only in specific cases. And it's only imposed because we feel that people are going to be deterred. But once that deterrent factor is gone, people stop. Most rabbis today, most courts today will not impose an oath. So what would they do in this case? If you walk into a modern court, a modern Jewish court, a modern Jewish based in, and Andy gives me a claim of completed, Andy says I owe him 100. Andy says I owe Andy 100. I admit I only owe Andy 50. Well, the Talmud says you make me swear, but now they're not going to make me swear today. So what do? So what they do is, in a case where the Torah says to swear, but we're not supposed to swear, but now they're not going to impose an oath, what they do is they'll make me compromise. In other words, I have to pay 50, and then the additional 50 that I have to swear about, they'll make up shar, they'll make a compromise. I'll pay you part of that, depending on what the rabbis feel, how much to pay. Right? So if I don't have to take an oath, then I don't owe you anything. If I have to take an oath, then I have to pay you partially. But that's not Maimonides, that's post-Maimonides. That's hundreds of years later. But it's interesting that, yes, it's tailored. You see clearly that the Torah's logic is talking to people who feared the third commandment in the Ten Commandments. The third commandment, Ten Commandments, is the only commandment where it says in the Ten Commandments that God will not forgive someone who takes his name in vain. It doesn't say God won't forgive somebody who serves idols, right? Even though in some sense serving idols is worse. But it says God will not forgive somebody who will take his name in vain. So people in that culture were very conscious about, we're very careful about not taking an oath falsely. So that's why this works. Or I don't know if it works, that's the logic of the laws here.
Thank you.
Okay, we'll continue. Look, this is code. It's not supposed to be exciting. It's not supposed to be debate. It's supposed to be straightforward. So we'll learn a little bit more. We'll see what happens. Section 2. What happens in Section 2? Section 2, Maimonides lays out the cases where the Torah imposes an oath. I already alluded to the fact that the Torah, there's only very specific cases where a person has to take an oath from the perspective of the Torah. And Maimonides lists all those cases. Then there are other cases that the rabbis impose an oath. And Maimonides lists some of those as well. And there's a very interesting difference between the way the rabbis impose an oath and the Torah imposes an oath. So we're going to get into that whole oath discussion. So we'll jump right in. We'll read a paragraph and then maybe we'll explain. We'll see from there. So let me just try to share the screen again and we will see what we could make of this. So we are at section 2, we're the big 2. Here we go. There are only 3 individuals who are obligated by scriptural law to take an oath. What are the 3 cases? So the 3 cases are, number 1, which we just mentioned, a person who denied a portion of the claim of movable property. That's one case. Modeh b'miktzat, the partial admission, which we mentioned before. The second case we also mentioned before, a person obligated by one witness. Right? We said that before. We said that's not explicitly in the Torah, but it's derived from the Torah. What? If Andy says I owe him $100, I deny it, but Andy has one witness supporting his claim that I owe him $100. So one witness is not enough to make me pay, but one witness is enough to make me take an oath. Those are the first 2 cases that we already mentioned. What is the third case where the Torah imposes an oath? That's the third case is and a watchman. Torah, in Hebrew, it's called a shomer, a guardian. Here they call it a watchman. If you ask me to watch something for you while you go on vacation, and I come back and I make a claim that would make me, that will absolve me from payments, depending on the scenario. But let's say I say it was stolen, and let's say it's a case where I don't have to pay if it was stolen. So the Torah says I, the guardian, the watchman, have to take an oath that indeed it was stolen, and then I don't have to pay. So those are the 3 cases. And here we bring the verse, Maimonides quotes the verse, for with regard to a watchman, Exodus states, the oath of God shall be between them. We have already explained the oath required of a watchman in Hilchot Schirut. We already discussed those laws. So to summarize the first half of 2, is there's exactly 3 scenarios where the Torah says that a person who is taking a person has to take an oath, only 3 scenarios. The 3 scenarios are partial admission, which we discussed. If there's one witness testifying that I owe money, only one witness, then I have to take an oath. And the third case, if I'm a watchman and I say it's not my fault, it was stolen, it's out of my control, I don't have to pay. But if I'm a watchman, then the Torah says I don't have to pay, but I have to take an oath. And now in the second half of 2, we list various cases where the rabbi said I have to take an oath. The person has to take an oath. And we're going to say all those cases are rabbinic. It's not biblical. So we'll read the second half of 2. Why not? Each of these 3 individuals takes an oath and becomes free of his obligation to pay. So in other words, it's a defensive oath. If somebody has a claim to make me pay, I take an oath and then I don't have to pay anymore. In contrast, those who take an oath and collect the money they claim. Okay, so let's talk about this for a second. So there is a case where all the first 3 cases, it's a case where by taking an oath, I don't have to pay. But then if you comb through the Talmud, you will see that there are cases where I could take an oath and collect. It's not taking an oath to defend my property, right? The previous case, what was the previous case? Andy says I owe him money. I deny it. I partially deny it. I have to take an oath. If I take an oath, then I don't have to pay. So the biblical, from the Torah, there is only 3 scenarios. There's only 3 scenarios where one has to take an oath, and all those scenarios, the oath is here to help me defend my property. I don't have to pay if I take an oath. But the rabbis have other forms of oath, and there are a few cases where the opposite is true. It's not that I take an oath to defend my claim to make me not have to pay, but actually there are oaths where the rabbis impose that I can take an oath and collect. So if I owe you, if I claim that you owe me money, in certain cases, if I take an oath, I could collect the money. But all that type of oath, of taking an oath to collect, is rabbinic, it's not biblical. And we're going to mention the cases where that applies. We're going to mention some of those cases. So it's interesting. Each case here is interesting, and each case here is a big deal. So I'll try to go through it carefully so we make sure every case gets the right amount of attention, at least a little bit of attention. So what's an example? An employee. So an employee is an interesting case. So what's the scenario here? The scenario here is as follows. Usually, like I said, the Torah's perspective is that if someone makes a claim against me and they don't have proof, then I don't have to pay. But the rabbis say, in certain cases, the rabbis say we have to change the law. We have to allow for people to be able to be believed. And when do we believe the person? So there are a few interesting cases. One interesting case is the case of the employee. What's the case of the employee? Okay? The case of the employee is as follows. Somebody hires me. Andy, you mind if I keep using your name? Do you mind? If you mind, send me a bill. Send me a bill at the end, and we'll take care of it. You know the famous joke? The famous joke is that the doctor complains to his friend, the lawyer, and says, I can't make any money in this community. He says, why not? He says, because I go to the synagogue on Shabbos, and everybody comes to me on Shabbos and shows me their ailments, and I tell them what to do, and then they don't come back to my office on Monday, so I can't bill them. What do I do? So the lawyer says, it's no problem at all. Here's what you do. You keep a mental list of all the people who consulted with you on Shabbos, and Monday morning when you get to the office, you just tell your secretary to bill them. And the doctor tells the lawyer, Mr. Lawyer, you saved my life. You saved my livelihood. I can't believe me. You've changed my life. So the doctor goes to his office on Monday morning, and he opens the mail, and he sees a bill from the lawyer. So that's the case. So if you want, you could bill me for using your name. Okay. So what's the scenario? Andy hires me, and that's not a dispute. I agree that Andy hired me. You agree you hired me. I come to Andy at the end of the day, and I say, Andy, could you please do me a favor? Could you please pay me? And Andy says, pay you? I paid you already. And I say, Andy, you never paid me. And now we have a dispute. So what do we do in this case? Again, there's no receipts, there's no check, it's all cash. I don't know, what do we do? So what would the law be from the Torah's perspective? The Torah's perspective is Andy does not have to pay me. Why? Because I don't have any evidence. I claim that Andy owes me money. Andy claims he paid me. I don't have any witnesses that I was not paid. So I can't force Andy to pay me. Remember, the premise is that if I want to extract money from somebody else, the burden of proof is upon me. If I want Andy to pay me, the burden of proof is upon me. But I have no proof. So if I have no proof, the Torah says I don't have to. The biblical law would be that Andy does not want to pay me. But the rabbis say there's a problem here. What's the problem? The problem is that let's say both me and Andy are honest people. When I say let's say, I'm saying because of myself. Andy's an honest person, but let's say I'm also an honest person. So the rabbis are thinking about the scenario and they're saying, let's assume both people are honest. Let's assume somebody made a mistake. Who's more likely to have made a mistake? The employee or the employer? So the rabbis feel that it's more likely that the employer made a mistake. Why? Because the employer has so many more things to juggle. He's got to pay. He's got a whole payroll. He has to worry about the production. He has to worry about the IRS. He has to worry about paying rent. He's got all these expenses. He's too much going on his plate. It's more likely that he would make a mistake. The employee, all he's thinking about from 8 o'clock in the morning is the paycheck, right? So it's not likely that he was paid and he forgot. So the rabbis say in this case, what we're going to do is, because it's a unique case of an employee-employer relationship, we'll say that we want the employee to get paid. So we'll say that we trust the employee. The employee could get paid if he's willing to take an oath. So if the employee takes an oath and says, I promise I was not paid, you see what the oath means. The oath is not just a promise. You have to hold the Torah scroll. It's not so simple. But the employee takes an oath and gets paid. So you see, this is very different than the biblical type of oath. The biblical type of oath is that the person taking an oath does not have to pay. Here, it's the person taking the oath gets paid. So it's a different form of an oath. So what are the cases? We said there's the case of the employee. There's another case is a person who was injured. So that's another case. Let's say there's a bully. There's a bully, and we know that person damaged me. We're just not sure how much the damage was. So who are we going to trust in this case? Are we going to trust the aggressor, or are we going to trust the victim? So the rabbis feel in this case you trust the victim, provided that the victim will take an oath. The victim has to take an oath, and then he could extract money in certain cases. And there's one more case. It's also an interesting case. Hapoigim Ishtarai. That's a case of a person who impairs the legal power of his promissory note and the like. So what's that scenario? That's an interesting scenario as well. I have a document. Andy has a document that says, it's an interesting case. I don't want to go into it too deeply, but Andy has a document that says I owe him money. I say, Andy, I paid you back. Who do we believe in that case? We should believe Andy. Andy has a document. But what happens if Andy undermines his document? He impairs the document. How does he impair the document? He says that he agrees. So Andy comes and says, you owe me Menachem, you owe me $100 because I paid you, and here's the proof, here's the document. I say, Andy, I paid you back. And Andy says, well, I was only paid back partially. So I'm undermining the document. In that case, the law is, without getting into too many details, in that case, the law is if Andy wants to collect it, even though he has a document, he has to take an oath. Andy will take an oath and Andy will collect. So these are cases where you make a claim and you're believed you can collect money if you take an oath. The bottom line is going to be all this is rabbinic. And we have other cases. And similarly, those who take an oath because there is a possibility of a claim being lodged against them. For example, partners and sharecroppers all take oaths because of our sages' ordinances. So for example, let's talk about partners for a second. Let's say me and Andy go into a partnership. And after a year, we split the partnership. I'm the investor, Andy is the active. I'm the investor and Andy is the active partner. So after a year, I come to Andy and I say, okay, Andy, let's split. Give me half the profits. And Andy gives me half the profits. And then I claim that I say, Andy, I don't know if this is all the profits. Maybe there are more profits that you're not sharing with me. So in that case, the law is that the partner that ran the business has to take an oath that he does not owe any more money. And the same thing is with a sharecropper. A sharecropper is that I'm the field owner. Somebody comes to me and says, I'll work your land and I'll pay you, instead of paying rent, I'll pay a certain percent of the produce that was yield, that the field will yield. And in that case, the sharecropper comes to pay me, and I say, listen, my friend, you're paying me whatever it is, 100 pounds of grain. I think you owe me more. I think the field produced more. In that case, the person takes an oath and does not have to pay. So what are we getting from all these cases? Says Maimonides, all these oaths, because all take oaths because of our sages' ordinances. So we say these cases are not a biblical oath, it's a rabbinic oath. Although all these oaths are ordained by rabbinic decree, they all resemble scriptural oath, and all must be taken while holding a sacred article. So Maimonides says something interesting, another detail that we didn't know, and that is when the Torah says you have to take an oath and you go to court to take an oath, you actually have to hold something holy, either a Torah scroll, some cases a pair of tefillin, but you actually have to hold the Torah scroll and take an oath saying God's name, holding the Torah. So that's serious business. That's true about the biblical oath, but it's also true about the rabbinic oath. So when the rabbis imposed an oath, they also imposed an oath that is similar to the biblical oath, in the sense that the people, whoever's taking the oath actually has to hold the Torah. So what did we just do here? There's a lot of details here. It's 10:46. We're going to stop here. What did we just do here? What we did is we laid out, Maimonides lays out in section 1 and section 2 of chapter 1. Section 1, he lists all the biblical forms of oath. There are only 3 forms of biblical oath. And then section 2, he says there is a concept called rabbinic oath. And we mentioned some of them, but there's more to come. There's more to come, but we mentioned at least some of them. And we say both the biblical oaths and the rabbinic oaths are both going to be, you both have to, in the ones that we listed, you have to actually hold a Torah scroll when you take the oath. So this is it for today. For those who are overwhelmed by the details on the law and you don't like law, don't worry. Tomorrow, Wednesday, we're back to stories. The plan is to do a little bit just like we did the book of Ruth, which was a good story. So maybe we'll spend a class or two, depending on how long it takes to finish. We'll do tomorrow, Wednesday, God willing, in good health, the book of Jonah. It's a short book. It's only 1 chapter, but we'll go for it. We'll get ready for Yom Kippur. Yom Kippur just around the corner. No, I'm kidding. But it's coming up soon. So we'll do a little bit of Jonah. And maybe if people would like, we'll continue. We'll do Tuesdays. We'll do Maimonides on Tuesdays. We'll see how it goes. Anybody wants to ask a question, go ahead. Jill, it looks like you want to ask a question, but you have to unmute yourself. Actually, maybe even I can unmute you with the, wonderful technology. No,
okay.
Yeah, there you go, Jill.
How much does this law inform Israeli law today?
Not much. There are other forms of the Torah that inform Israeli law. For example, we mentioned the laws of the guardians, the laws of the watchmen. The laws of the watchmen is something that Israeli law adapted from the Torah because it's so logical. This specific law does not apply today in Israel, but like I mentioned, it doesn't even apply out of Israel because, in other words, even in the rabbinic court, they're not going to oppose a law. They're not going to oppose an oath. In Israel is basically British law, because when the state of Israel was founded, they adapted British law because they're based on the British mandate. And then any law that the Knesset makes changes from the British law, but the default is British law. Now there have been many cases where the Israeli Knesset adapts the Torah law because away from the British law. For example, the Guardians is one example, but an interesting example is the law of whether you have to. There's a biblical commandment that says you may not stand idly by at your brother's blood. So, for example, if you see someone getting hurt, you have to intervene. That's what the Torah says. The Torah says if you see someone getting hurt, you have to intervene. Now, in America, there could never be a law that says that if someone's getting hurt, I have to call the police. It's impossible because I have personal freedom. Nobody can tell me what to do as long as I'm not harming somebody else. But the Torah says, no, the Torah says, if you see someone hurt, you have to intervene. So the Israeli Knesset moved away from I think it was in the early 80s, they made a specific law called the law of not standing idly by on your brother's blood. And they said the law is that if someone is hurt, you have to help them. Okay, you don't want to help them, you can call the police, but you have to call the police. So that's an example where the Israeli law, where the Israeli Knesset moves away from the Israeli law, from British law, and adapts something specific from the Torah law. But it happens in some cases, but not in all cases. Most cases, it's British law. This is a case, like I said, the oath is not the application of oaths is not something that applies in Israeli law today. But again, it's interesting to study simply because it tells you the mind frame. It tells you the mind frame of how the Torah saw, the Talmud understood Torah, and the Talmud understood the mind frame of the people, of the Jewish people at the time. And like I said, if you say the careful analysis, for example, just a case where who do you believe, the person who's more believable, the person with the complete denial or partial denial? So Andy demonstrated how that perspective changes. From the Torah, we have one perspective. The common law is another perspective. So you're getting a lot of psychology here hidden within the law.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you.
What story are we doing tomorrow?
We're going to do the story. We're going to do the book of Jonah.
Okay, thank you.
Somebody asks, is there any civil repercussions if it's found that you lied in an oath, that is evidence is found later? The answer is yes. The answer is yes. There are ramifications. What are the ramifications? So one of the interesting ramifications are that you're no longer believed if you take an oath. You're no longer believed for taking an oath, and this is very, very interesting. So we'll get to it later. But this is fascinating. If I walk up to someone in the street and say you owe me money, biblical law is that they don't have to pay. But we'll see later that the rabbis imposed an oath, and I basically would have to swear to defend myself. So Andy walks up to me and says, Menachem, you owe me $100. I say, Andy, I don't owe you anything. The rabbis are going to say, I take an oath that I don't know anything. What happens if I lied? Now no longer can I take an oath that I don't know anything because I'm not believable anymore. So now instead of me taking an oath that I don't owe you money, Andy will take an oath that he does owe me money, that I owe him money. So in other words, the legal defenses that I have for taking an oath and being believed is taken away from me. So basically, I'm vulnerable to a lot of claims. The short answer to what you're saying, Jonathan, is the short answer is that in a system like the Torah, the most important thing you have is your credibility. And if you take an oath and you found to have lied, your credibility is shattered, and therefore in all future cases, you're very vulnerable. That's the short answer. Okay, it looks like we did Maimonides, so everybody understands, because Maimonides is a book full of clarity, and he is very straightforward. Mark, go ahead.
That's a question.
Yes.
So he distinguishes between rabbinic and biblical commands. From a practical standpoint, what's the difference between the two? Is it a question of how you're punished if you don't do it, or
okay? So most biblical commandments, most biblical. We only did number 2. Well, later we'll get to number 3. There are most rabbinic oaths. The difference is you don't hold the Torah, so it's not as severe. The things we listed in number 2 are rabbinic laws, rabbinic oaths, but they're similar to the Torah's oaths. So you're actually gonna hold the Torah. And now there's debate. Some people would say that a rabbinic oath, you don't even actually say God's name. So there could be some differences depending on what opinion you follow. But biblical is the most severe. There's a biblical law, you have to hold the Torah and you have to mention God's name. Then the least severe is the standard rabbinic oath, where you don't hold the Torah and you don't say God's name. And then in number 2, where we mentioned, is somewhere in between. You would hold the Torah, but you wouldn't say God's name, at least according to some opinions. So the answer is the severity is not as high. If you see what I'm saying.
But isn't there a whole issue that the oral law was given with the written law, and therefore, I mean, why would it be of different severity?
Okay, so this is a full discussion. This will take 6 weeks, but I'll give it to you in short give it to you in short. If you look at, when you say oral law is a broad category. There's a category of the oral law which is what we derive from the written Torah. It's not written explicitly, but we derive it. That, if you read carefully, that is considered biblical. How do I know? In number 1, we said that if one witness could impose an oath, Maimonides classifies that as biblical, even though it doesn't say so in the Bible. It's derived from the Bible. Right? The rabbis say, the Torah says one witness would not make me pay. And the rabbis derive, he won't make me pay, but he could make me take an oath. So that is derived from the Torah. The rabbis derive it from the Torah. But because the rabbis derive it from the Torah, that's what you mentioned, it has the same legal authority as Torah law, because it was derived from the Torah. That's why that's the same. Then there's another category within the oral Torah, which is not derived from the Torah. It's called what we call legislated. The rabbis say the Torah does not say you have to take an oath, but the rabbis, the sages have a power to legislate and say the rabbis are going to impose an oath. So in that case, it does not have the same force as biblical law, because the claim is not that the Bible meant this. See what I'm saying? When it's derived, the claim is this is what the Bible meant. It didn't say so explicitly, but this is what the Bible meant. So that has the force of biblical law, even according to Maimonides. Like I said, I just demonstrated that Maimonides says that there's a biblical law. One witness will impose a biblical oath, even though doesn't say so in the Torah explicitly. It's derived from the Torah. But then there's legislated oaths. The rabbis say the Torah doesn't say you have to make an oath, but we're going to impose an oath. And that's why that is of lesser severity, because the rabbis themselves say that it's lesser severity. It's not something that the Torah imposes, it's something that the rabbis impose. But that takes 6 weeks. We had a JLI. The first time they ran the JLI was actually 8 weeks. Then they cut it down to 6 weeks about what exactly is the oral Torah. They used to call it Sinai to cyberspace. Then they call it some other name, but the Sinai to cyberspace name is much better. But that was 8 weeks. So I don't know if you want to sign up to that one. The other one, the title's not as good, but it's only 6 weeks. So I guess there's ups and downs in everything in life, pros and cons. Okay, I hope everybody enjoyed the time. Start your day with Torah study. At a minimum, it's going to sharpen your mind. It's also going to connect you to God. So we'll start your day with spirituality. So everybody, I bless you with a good day, a healthy day, and hopefully we'll see you sometime in the future. God willing, tomorrow we do the study of the book of Jonah, and we see what we can make of that. Have a wonderful day, and we'll see you in good health. Be well.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Be well. Thank you.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you.
Thank you, Rabbi. Yashikar.
Thank you. Thank you.